You have the right to remain silent.
I am a police officer, working on an emergency response team on a busy London borough. We took a call to a suspected domestic incident in a block of flats. The informant said that she could hear screaming and sounds of disturbance coming from the flat above her own. Once we arrived, my colleague and I knocked on the door of the flat the informant said the noise was coming from. I had heard nothing on my way up and certainly couldn't hear any disturbance coming from the address. To be honest, I heard nothing at all. After knocking twice, we had no response. My colleague left me to go downstairs and speak directly to the informant. I stayed by the door. I knocked again, and after some time, it was answered by an elderly woman. She had clearly been asleep and was alarmed to see me standing outside. I told her that someone had called saying that they could hear a disturbance coming from within her address. I asked her if there was anyone else inside with her. She looked bemused and told me that she lived alone and had been sleeping. I asked her if I could come in to satisfy myself that no one else was there. She invited me in, and I walked into what was a small two-bedroom flat. The flat was in darkness, apart from her hall light and her bedside lamp. I began searching through the flat. As I approached the final door, the living room, my colleague called me up on the radio. He told me that he was on his way and asked if I was okay. I told him everything was fine, wondering why he sounded so flustered. He told me that he was with the informant and could also hear screaming and loud thuds coming from the flat I was in. I told him he must be mistaken, as I was almost done searching the flat and that I had heard nothing whatsoever. I have to admit a feeling of unease as I opened the final door. Like all the other rooms, it was in darkness but was freezing cold. My breath misted immediately. There was no one in the room and no signs of disturbance. My window was open. I called my colleague and asked him to listen out for my footfall. He said he could hear my feet as I stamped them, but said that the screaming had stopped. This coincided with me opening the door. I left shortly after, apologizing to the elderly woman for waking her. I have no rational explanation for this at all. My colleague and I left, feeling very creeped out. A few weeks ago, I'd gotten dispatched to a 911 call that involved a female frantically screaming at the dispatcher, "She's going to kill me! She's going to kill me! Come quick! I'm at..." address of where she is at. Naturally, every unit within range of my sector and myself had radioed in a response, and we were all hauling ass to get there. Once we got there, we discovered the house was abandoned for some years now, and so we set a cordon around with officers watching all exits. As my shift partner, myself, and a female officer announced themselves and made entry into the residence. We cleared all of the first floor and proceeded to the second, and as soon as we got to the top of the stairs, a slight movement spooked us, and me and my partner immediately raised our weapons into a room where there was only a noose. Both he and I thought we saw a body on it at first glance. There was nothing there. We cleared the rest of the second floor and took a closer look at the noose. Some dried up blood and what I think was peeled off skin on it from an earlier suicide that occurred over a dozen years ago. We thought it might have been recent, but we didn't know at the time. Anyways, immediately after we cleared the house, we determined that it was way too dead, for lack of a better word, to have been used recently. However, we called in some detectives. But before we all stepped out, we all agreed we didn't see what just happened. Reason why is my service has a policy on what could be constituted as paranormal instances. Where the second something like that happens, you're immediately suspended from duty and given your badge, your gun, your duty belt and your vest, before being taken on the spot to a psychiatrist/psychologist for a full comprehensive evaluation. Needless to say, I immediately called my supervisor at the end of a shift and told him about it, and did the right thing by going in for evaluation. Something to be said about integrity. I've driven past their house multiple times in the past weeks, and have always sunk deeper into my seat as I've driven past. Something about it. It's like you could actually feel there was something off about it. City seems to agree with me. As of 3 days ago, the house is the #1 demolition priority in my sector, and will be down by the end of the month. I'm just not happy that I'm going to have to go back inside next week to collect anything that might be of interest to both the city and my superiors. Luckily, I won't be going in alone. Also, the female who called in the 911 call was charged for public mischief under the pretext of misuse of 911 and misleading peace officers. Not sure if you guys would want to hear an Asian story, but I thought it's worth sharing. This was told by my dad when I was 12. Even now, when I ask him about the story, he can remember every vivid detail like it just happened last week. My dad was in the police force for 20 years, and when he was just a rookie, he had to conduct nighttime roadblocks meant to catch drunk drivers. They had done it many times before, and this night started routine enough for them. That was until this Toyota Corolla drove up to them with what looked like a white blanket on its roof, flapping in the wind. They thought it was weird, but did not see anything amiss about it. One of them even joked that this guy was multitasking by drying his laundry and driving home at the same time. The laughs stopped when the lone car came closer, and all of them saw what looked like a woman in white, lying face down on top of the car. The woman seemed to slide like a slug backwards until she disappeared behind the car, as it eventually came to a stop in front of them. It took a few minutes for my dad's team to recompose themselves, as they stared at each other as if to say, "You guys saw that, right?" The most senior of them finally stepped up and shot the usual questions to the driver. There was a noticeable quiver in his voice as he made conversation and asked him to step out of the vehicle. My dad's team inspected the whole vehicle, including the boot, and found nothing strange in it. The driver was a good-looking staff sergeant in the army who was heading home from a company event earlier that night and admitted to have had a few cans of beer. He said he laid down in his bunk to sleep it off, hence why he was driving home at that time. It was 4 a.m. He passed their sobriety test, and they started to ask him if he saw anything weird during his drive. Initially he said no, but after more questioning, he mentioned that he had to swerve to avoid what looked like a bird that was flying upside down. It was spooky, but he didn't think that was a detail worth sharing with police officers. The senior then told the guy to chill out at a 24-hour coffee shop before heading home. The locals believe that if a malevolent spirit follows you, making a pit stop confuses them so they can't set up shop in your house. After some confusion of his own, the driver finally caught on and nodded in agreement. After the guy leaves, they call into the station and cut the night short. I never knew what happened to the driver. I hope he's alright. Okay, so I was supervising an evening shift in a small town in rural Australia. We have a large river that snakes its way past the town and runs close to some of the residential areas. It's 1 kilometer wide in some parts, has steep banks and thick bush in the bed when it's dry. One of my crews were tied up with something and the other was attending 2 brothers threatening suicide after having a fight at a residence near the bank of the river. I heard the job and attended to give my crew a hand. Upon arrival, we found one brother who was self-harming and on drugs. We restrained him to prevent him from harming himself. He was telling us he wanted to kill himself and was taken to hospital via ambulance for mental health. As we had made the apprehension, my crew had to accompany the ambulance for everyone's safety. My crew leaves, and then I'm told by the family that the other brother had run off, down the dry riverbank, threatening to hang himself. The family said he was drunk but didn't have anything to actually hang himself with. I was concerned, and attended the riverbank near where they thought he went down the steep riverbank. Both crews were busy and I was by myself, at night, and it started raining lightly. I parked my unit at the top of the bank with the lights pointed onto the bush, hoping that if he saw my lights, he'd come towards me. I got out my torch and made my way down the bank. I found a small clearing and a small distance away was thick bush. I heard something moving in the bush. It sounded like something taking deliberate steps in the bush. I yelled out thinking it was the guy I was after. I told him I was there to help and pleaded with him to come out. No response, and when I was talking, whatever it was stopped moving. I kept talking, attempting to make contact as my instincts told me someone was in the thick bush in front of me. No response. My torch couldn't penetrate the bush, but I could hear distinct footfalls. I stopped making any noise, turned off my light and stood still, listening. I hear movement coming towards me in the bush. I remained still and listened. It came closer. Without thinking, my hand went down to my gun and I was ready to draw. I turned on my light and walked forward, and hear whatever it was move away from me. I backed off, turned off my light and remained silent. It started coming closer to me, probing my position. I repeated the exercise once more and once more it backed off and came back at a different angle. By this stage, I was on high alert. Something told me to GTFO. I got this heavy, eerie feeling. Any animal that was down there would have run off upon my approach. No animal I know approaches and probes a human's position at night like that. Once I got the overwhelming feeling to leave, I backed off with my hand on my gun, and I didn't turn my back until I had to climb up the bank. Once at the top and back with my car, I felt a lot better, but I could still hear something moving in the bush. I stayed there a while, as I was curious. I left and conducted inquiries, finding the missing brother on the other side of town, fast asleep and fine. To this day, I don't know what I ran into down in the riverbed that night. Hello watchers and listeners, thank you so much for watching. A huge thank you to all the Reddit users who kindly allowed me to use their stories. I couldn't do this without you. And of course, thank you to all of those who continue to support me. I truly do appreciate it so much. And remember,
Papa loves you.